If evolution has really occurred, we ought to be able to see the evidence in the fossil record. After all, that's the record of the past. But if we look at that fossil record carefully, we see that there are no recorded instances of one type of an animal ever changing into another. There are no transitional forms.
One of my advisors is working in the field of paleontology and has been working on the distribution of fossils in the record, and has found that there are no interspecific transitional forms, something that, of course, the creation model would have predicted and did predict long before this research was done.
We ought to see cats, and we ought to see dogs, and we ought to see cogs and dats. We ought to see them in between. We ought not to be able to divide them like we are now. But that doesn't usually stop my evolutionary colleagues. They will make the statements over and over again that the fossil record is replete with these transitional forms. There are myriad transitional forms. There's really no problem finding transitional forms.
It's completely false to say that there's a lacking of transitional forms. We have plenty of them, more than sometimes we can cope with.
In fact, there are so many transitional forms between species that we must often fall back on statistical analysis to separate one from the other.
So the claim that there are no intermediates is simply a false claim.
During their interviews, several of these prominent scientists contradicted themselves, admitting that no transitional forms had been found, and proceeded to offer excuses for the lack of evidence.
The problem of transitional forms is one that all honest paleontologists have a problem with. The geologic record is incomplete. It's incomplete because of erosion that has eroded things away.
One of the things that also makes it a little more difficult in the fossil record is the rapidity with which evolution acts in very short bursts. It doesn't leave many transitional forms behind.
Let's go to the British Museum of Natural History, to the man who wrote the book there on evolution, Dr. Colin Patterson. I wrote to Dr. Patterson and asked him why he didn't put a single picture of an intermediate form or a connecting link in his book on evolution. Dr. Patterson now, who has 7 million fossils in his museum, said the following when he answered my letter, quote, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I certainly would have included them," unquote. Later he said, "I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one might make a watertight argument."
Because no fossil records exist to confirm evolutionary assumptions, dubious artworks are relied upon and exhibited as fact. Misleading artistic interpretations depict fish magically growing legs and changing into amphibians, extinct deer-like creatures mysteriously turning into horses, and monkeys becoming humans. Where non-existent transitional skeletons are needed to prove a point, skilled craftsmen substitute plastic and wooden models.
I'm very concerned about the way our museums present evolution as though it were a proven fact. And actually, false information is being presented. You see, since the museums don't have the transitional forms, they have to make them up out of thin air.
The November 1980 edition of Science Digest shows a drawing of a whale with legs as an evolutionary link between whales and cows. But the only fossil evidence for this mythological transition is a skull and several teeth, no leg bones.
Niles Eldridge at the American Museum said, "You're only limited by the credulity of your audience and your own imagination in making up these stories of what changed into what and what the intermediate forms were."
If we're talking about seeing evolution today, seeing one species changing into another species, that's not going to happen. Although there must be, from an evolutionary perspective, many transitional forms out there, the likelihood of finding any one of them is extremely low.
The more we learn about paleontology, that is fossils, the more certain we are that evolution is based on faith alone.
The National